This is an Autococker, the best known, most successful tournament paintball gun in the history of paintball. It's constructed of 6061 T6 material. The interior parts are stainless steel, 303. The exterior parts are stainless steel. It comes with an inline regulator, a sledgehammer regulator, special constructed barrel. It comes in 3 different versions: a mini cocker, an Autococker standard, and an STO. The Autococker is generally recognized as the most accurate long-range paintball gun in the world. Let's take a look at the internal components of an Autococker. When you pull the trigger, 2 things happen. The sear is lowered, and the 3-way actuating rod is pulled in the aft position. The 3-way reroutes the gas to the forward part of the ram. Now, the high pressure gas building up in the forward part of the ram will push on the pump rod, which in turn pushes backwards on the cocking block. Now, the cocking block is going to do 2 things at this point. It's going to pull the bolt into the back position to allow the ball to drop into the breech area, and it will also pull on the cocking rod, which pulls on the hammer and pulls the hammer in the back position too. Now, at that point, you can see where the sear is not ready to latch yet. It won't latch until you release the trigger. Now, when you release the trigger, 2 things happen. The sear goes up to the latch on the cocking lug. The 3-way actuating rod will go forward, which allow the gas to build up in the back part of the ram, which pushes on the ram forward. The gas that's trapped into the ram will be vented out the back of the 3-way. And then the cocking block comes forward, it pushes the ball into the barrel area, and now the gun is ready to fire. Take a close look at the sear when you pull the trigger. As you notice, the front part of the sear is riding on the ramp. When you pull back on the trigger, the sear rides up on a ramp, which drops the back of the sear itself, which releases the hammer. Now, as we mentioned earlier, there's 450 pounds of gas in the valve system. Okay, now it's trapped behind the main valve. When the hammer strikes the valve itself, it momentarily opens and allows gas to flow up through the valve guide itself, through the channel, and out the front of the bolt, which in turn fires the ball. That completes the gas flow. Before you start disassembling a gun, you should always wear safety glasses, and it's very critical that you remove the power source and degas the gun. After removing the hose, you can spin off the inline regulator. Remove the grips from the grip frame by removing the 2 retaining screws. We remove the beaver tail by removing 1 screw, 1032 at the back of the gun. Unscrew the cocking rod, remove the bolt, unscrew the cocking block, unscrew the velocity adjuster, remove the mainspring, remove the hammer. We'll show you how to do that later. That's a little difficult. Using a special tool, remove the valve guide retaining nut. After removing the 1032 screws, holding the grip frame to the body, gently rotate the grip frame and remove it from the body, and be careful not to bend the 3-way actuating rod. Now you have to remove the bottom plug. This has to be removed prior to removing the valve guide. Now we can remove the valve guide, the valve, and the valve spring. Remove the 3-way actuating rod. Now we can remove the air receiver using a 1/4-inch 12-point socket. Now we remove the front block by using a 7/32 Allen wrench. The gun will reassemble in a reverse order as a disassemble. Once you're certain that there's no gas in the gun, the first thing we're going to do is remove the barrel. Now we remove the front cover. The next thing we're going to remove is a beaver tail. The regulator comes off fairly easy once that the hose assembly is removed from it. By removing the 2 screws in the grip frame, be careful not to bend the 3-way actuating rod. Rotate it out of the way and pull it down towards the table. And you can set this out of the way. Next thing we're going to do is move the bolt assembly. Move the pin, remove the bolt. Now we can remove the cocking rod. Next thing to come off would be the cocking block. Once you've removed the back block, it exposes the velocity adjuster. Insert a 3/16 Allen wrench in the velocity adjuster. Now by screwing the velocity adjuster clockwise, that increases the velocity. By counterclockwise, it decreases the velocity. Now we're going to screw it counterclockwise to remove the velocity adjuster itself. Once the velocity adjuster is removed, it exposes the area so you can remove the spring. This is called the mainspring. And once the mainspring's removed, now we can remove the hammer. Before the hammer is removed, you've got to move the hammer lug back up into the hammer itself. You do this by inserting the Allen wrench into the top of the body and rotating it counterclockwise. And you got to watch the bottom. You screw counterclockwise to move the cocking lug, which I'll point it out to you now, right there. It wants to be able to be up into the body of the hammer far enough to where it's going to clear the body when you remove it. Now it looks like it's going to clear. I usually use cocking rod, just screw it up inside it and pull the hammer out. And the next thing we're going to have to do is remove this plug. This plug here has to be removed prior to removing the valve guide assembly. Remember, when you put this plug back in, never tighten it, over tighten it. It pushes sideways on the valve guide assembly and may cause a leak. Once the plug is removed, now we can stick our special valve guide retaining nut tool into the back of the gun. Make sure it fits snug. I'm going to take the wrench, put on there, and we're going to rotate it counterclockwise to remove this nut. Once it's loose, you can remove the breakaway wrench. Now we can remove the nut itself. Once you broke the nut loose, you can turn it counterclockwise until the nut's free from the body. You slide it out. This is what the nut looks like. Okay, now this next thing we're going to remove, now that the valve guide retainer nut's removed, we're going to remove the valve guide. Break it loose, hold the gun straight up, shake it. Sometimes it's difficult to get out. Once it breaks free, it'll fall out. This is exhaust valve guide assembly as you'd see it in the gun. This is your spring. This is the exhaust valve, and this is the guide. Remember, the spring, the exhaust valve, and the guide. If you ever hear leaking down the barrel, the first thing to look at is your exhaust valve assembly. That's the only thing that would cause leaking. Next thing we're going to do is remove the three-way actuating rod. Now when we do that, if you've had a gun that shoots properly before disassembling, the best thing to do is remove the three-way actuating rod, three-way adapter, and the constant air adapter as a unit. In order to do that, pull out on a rod to expose a small Allen wrench in the forward part of the adapter. Loosen it up like this. Now we use a quarter 20 12-point or quarter-inch 12-point socket to remove the CA retaining bolt. Once the retaining bolt screw is out and loose, remember, don't pull straight out. Pull backwards on it, and that'll pull it away from the three-way actuating rod. This is the assembly as you'd see it right here. Now we're going to remove the hoses. We can completely remove the hoses if we wish, but the way I do it, I'm going to remove the hose from the regulator, one end of the ram. You do this by sliding this collar back. Gently grab the hose and pull. Next thing we're going to remove, once the hoses are loose, we're going to take the regulator off. It takes a 7/16 wrench. This is an area right here that we have to clean and blow off. We don't want that foreign particles to get inside the regulator. Also with the front block. Now we can unscrew the three-way. Notice the hoses are still on it. These are very difficult hoses to put on if you was to take them off the three-way. Okay, when disassembling the three-way, first thing you want to do is remove the C-clip in the end. This little devil will fly all over the place, so you want to make sure that you pull it out, keep it, lay it on a safe place. Once you got the C-clip removed, just take the three-way, push down on the table, and the end cap should pop up. Gently grab a hold of the three-way end cap. You don't want to scar the OD of it, and you pull. There's an O-ring which makes it difficult to get out. This is a three-way end cap. Notice the O-ring? It's a static O-ring, doesn't move. Next thing you want to do, get the three-way out, take a small Allen wrench, push on a three-way shaft, and you can pull it out. This is three-way shaft. Notice the two O-rings. If you have any leaking outside either end of the three-way, then it's usually the O-rings. If trigger sticks in the aft position, it's again usually the O-rings. One thing that you have to pay attention to is this detent. This detent has to line up with a hole in the three-way adapting collar, otherwise it'll be misaligned. Now we can remove the ram. Be careful when you're removing the rod assembly from the body that you don't bend anything. Again, these areas right here with Loctite on them is areas you have to clean prior to reassembling the gun. Slide it right out the front of the block. Put it in a place where somebody doesn't bend the rod. Now we can remove the front block. Pay attention to the O-rings, because you do have O-rings on this retaining bolt. You can see one of them right here. It's between the head of the bolt and the block assembly. Unscrew it. This is the other one. The last thing to remove on the body is a ball detent. Now we completely disassemble the main body. The next thing we have to disassemble is the trigger assembly. One thing you got to watch out for when you're removing the grip frame assembly is this little spring. There's a little ball inside that hole. This is the ball that you want to make sure you put it somewhere it doesn't roll off on the table. Now the next thing I'm going to remove is the trigger shoe. Next thing we can remove is the safety. Remove the safety by removing the C-clip. This little devil here can go across the room, so you want to make sure when it comes off that you secure it. Wiggle the safety, and it'll come right out the side of the grip. Next thing we're going to remove is the grips. You usually don't have to remove both sides, just remove one. In order to remove the sear spring, which is this little item right here, you got to have the grip off. So we just want to make sure this is another item that will fly across the room. You want to pull it out, nice and easy. In order to remove the sear, you have to remove the sear retaining pin. Once the pin is out, the sear falls out. This is the trigger. Behind the trigger there's a trigger spring. You got to watch out for this. It'll fall and roll off the table and you have a hard time finding it. This is the sear spring. It's a sear retaining pin. This is the sear. The trigger spring. First thing we have to do is put the trigger spring into the trigger assembly. Now the trigger spring has a cone shape to it. You want the cone part of it facing outward. Stick it into the trigger like this, push it back. Now that the spring is installed into the frame, we're going to put the trigger in. You got to push the spring back, make sure it's seated. Hold the trigger in an angle so you can catch the spring in the front of it. Take a small object, push back on the spring so it snaps into place. Install the sear. And you got to line the hole up in the sear. Sometimes this can be difficult. You want to lay it on its side. Line the hole up. I use an Allen wrench. Once the two holes are lined up, I'm going to tap it into place. I use a little wrench. You want approximately the same amount of the pin protruding out each side. This pin actually helps align the grips also. This is a sear spring. It's going to go on the bottom of the sear, holds the sear up into position. You pull it down and slip it over the lug. You notice there's a little lug in there. Now it's in position. Now we can take and put the grips back on the gun. Remember I told you earlier, that's the line-up pin. Also holds the sear in. It goes in this hole to that pin. Keeps the grip assembly from twisting. Now we can put the safety in. Stick it through the hole, wiggle the trigger a little bit, and it'll flop right in. And we're going to put the little clip on that flies all over the place. And what I usually do is push this back so you don't have to lift up on it. Just slide it over the hole. Take some pliers. Grab both of them. Snap it into place. Remember the little spring in the ball? We're going to insert the ball first. Careful not to lose it. Now we're going to insert the spring in the hole. The last thing you want to do in the assembly is put on the trigger shoe. Drop it into place. I usually try to hold my finger on that spring so it doesn't fall out. Line the trigger up. It doesn't take a lot of pressure to hold this on, so you don't need to crank pressure onto it. Strip it out. Now we can set this aside for installing on the main body a little later. When installing the three-way actuating rod and air receiver assembly, remember I told you earlier about the little detent in there? You want to make sure that the detent, which is right here, is facing up or out. It's very important. The next thing we're going to do is take the forward set screw out of the three-way adapting collar. Make sure it doesn't roll off. And make sure the O-ring is in the air receiver. Okay, now the important part. You got two things to do. You got to line this bolt up with this hole here in the main body, and also you got to shove the three-way adapting collar on right here so it lines up with that detent. So I'm going to put the collar on first. As you see right here, push it in. And I'm going to slide the air receiver up. That lines up with the hole. And I'm going to tighten the receiver up. Now we take an Allen wrench. I want to push a three-way shaft back so it'll expose the hole area. And if you can see right there that the detent's lined up with the hole. Now it's ready to install the set screw. Now if you didn't have it lined up and you tighten it, this set screw wouldn't be flush with the top of the adapting collar. Now we're going to install a valve assembly into the body. Now if you notice there's two holes in the valve guide. Some valve guides only have a hole on one side. If it only has a hole on one side with a detent in one side, then you want the hole to point up towards the feed tube. Now to install this, I'll take the nut, put it on the valve guide assembly, or tool. Take all this and put it on, hold it straight up. Insert it in the hole. Start screwing it in. Sometimes if the hole doesn't line up, you stick a scribe in there and it'll actually rotate on it. What I usually do, stick an Allen wrench in that hole. That keeps it kind of lined up. Put a socket on the tool, tighten it up. Once it's tight, you want to make sure that the hole lines up. You line up this hole with a hole in the valve guide assembly. Now we can install the plug. Now remember, you don't want to tighten down on this plug real tight. You just want to snug it. The only thing this is to keep the air from coming out. You just take a 2-finger snug on it and that's it. Don't tighten it real tight. Now we want to put the hammer in an adjuster or velocity adjuster in. So we slide the hammer. Remember, there's two sides. You want to put the Allen wrench side facing up and the lug side facing towards the slotted hole. Push that in there, stick the Allen wrench in, make sure everything lines up. You just start screwing it in. This is where the adjustment's going to come after you get the assembly together. I usually put it about 25, 30 thousandths below the surface of the base of the gun. That's a good starting point. Now we're going to remove the cocking rod, put the mainspring back in, put the velocity adjuster in. Well, there's two sides to the velocity adjuster, a flat side, one with a recess in it. The recess goes towards the spring. Start it. I usually install it with about 3 to 5 threads below the back surface of the main body. Now we can install the trigger frame. Remember the little spring and ball. Okay, you got to line through the actuating rod up with a slot inside. There's a hole in the trigger. You want to come back in just like you normally do. Rotate it around, hold it in place, and start the 2 screws. Longer screw goes in the front, not the back. Start it in the hole. Okay, now we're going to install the back block. Remove the cocking rod. Push your pump rod forward. Install the block. Rotate it until it hits the main body. Now I want you to continue rotating it until the bolt hole lines up. Okay, you rotate this hole right here till it's on the bottom or facing down. Put it in the back of the cocking block. Put your retainer pin in. Cocking rod. Now we can install a ball detent. Then we can install a beaver tail. And the main body and trigger frame is all installed. Now we're ready to install the inline regulator. These inline regulators are set at the factory at 450 pounds, but they are adjustable. By removing the end cap, it exposes aluminum slotted piece. All right, remember, when you turn in this aluminum slotted piece, for every quarter turn of movement, in or out, it's going to change the pressure about 60 pounds. Now if you screw it in, which is clockwise, the pressure is going to go down. If you screw it out, which is counterclockwise, the pressure is going to go up. Remember, 1/4 turn equals around 60 pounds. And we're going to put the cap back on. Screw the inline regulator into the air receiver. Now we're ready to install the front cap. Then we can install the barrel. About barrels, remember that the gun is mechanical, and 9 times out of 10 when you have velocity fluctuation problem, it's not the gun, it's the fit of the paint to the barrel. So always fit that properly and make sure you have plenty of barrels available, because the paint varies from batch to batch and field to field. Now we're just going to start adjusting the timing. What I usually do is pull back, cock the gun. I hold a 3-way shaft in the forward position. Now you got to pay attention to the trigger. Pull the trigger back and it fires. Well, it fires way early. In other words, you got a lot of clearance there before you start activating the 3-way shaft. So we want to drop that down, that clearance down a little bit, or timing. What I'm going to do is back off on the cocking lug. I think it's about a half a turn that we need to go. I took the Allen wrench and backed it off a half a turn. Now we're going to cock it again. Hold the cocking or 3-way adjusting rod forward. 3-way rod. Now it's getting better. We're going to back off on it a little bit more. Take it another half turn. Cock the gun again. Now it won't cock. That means that we're too high. So we're going to go back down or clockwise with the cocking lug. Go in about a 1/4 of a turn. See if it'll cock. Cock. Oop. Still won't cock. See how it's skipping? Go back out a little bit more, or back down a little bit more. Good. And what we got here is probably the 3-way actuating rods out of adjustment. So we can't adjust that until we got air on it. That will be your fine-tuning adjustment, remember that. For the gun to operate properly, you must have a delay between the firing and the cocking sequence. Most people prefer the least delay as possible between those two sequences. This is accomplished by adjusting your three-way actuating rod. The first thing you want to do is loosen the set screw on a three-way adapting collar. Now, once a three-way adapting collar set screw has been loosened, by lengthening the rod, you're going to increase the delay. Most people are going to want to shorten the rod. This will decrease the time between the firing sequence and the cocking sequence. Now that you got the gun timed the way you want it, and you notice that it skip fires once in a while, that means when you pull the trigger it doesn't latch every time. There's two possible problems. One of them being that the cocking rod might be loose. So you want to reach down and turn that in the clockwise position and make sure it's tight. If it still does it, next thing would be to check would be your sear spring. You got to get to the sear spring by removing one grip or the other grip, and then what you want to do is check the tension on it. If the tension is too loose, then what's going to happen is when the sear lug comes up and hits against the sear, there's not enough tension to hold it up, so it's going to jump over the top of it and prematurely fire the gun. Because one other thing you might want to check if you got a skip shooting going on, and that's a back block adjustment. If the back block adjustment is incorrect, that means that the stroke within your ram won't allow the back block to come back far enough to cock the gun. So how you make that adjustment is you take, first thing you have to remove is your bolt. Your cocking rod. Now you want to make sure that your pump rod is in the forward position. So what I do is push on the back block, and I'll just hold it forward with my index finger. And then I'll rotate the back block clockwise until it stops. Now you make contact between the block and the body. Keep rotating it until you line up the hole to put your bolt back in. Then you reverse the sequence. Make sure that the large hole is down. Put the bolt back in. Put your pin in. Put your cocking rod in.